So what are some of the types of experiments? And if you printed these out, I think there's a little bit of space at the top there. I want to add above descriptives, there's two sorts of studies that I want to mention briefly. The longitudinal versus the cross-section. And a lot of this chapter, by the way, is very piecemeal in terms of it's just going to be choppy. There's not a great story to tell as much as I would like to have things have wonderful flow. So two kinds of studies that you might want to know about. One's a longitudinal study, and longitudinal studies are those that measure the same participants multiple times over a period of time. So I'm going to measure the same participants a number of times over a period of times. So what might be an example of that? So well, suppose I wanted to test the effects of a vaccine on intelligence and make sure that it's not having bad effects. So I would take my infant, give them the shot, then over a period of time, maybe 6 months later, measure intelligence. 10 years later, 20 years later, I could follow them throughout their lifetimes if I wanted and find my data. Now, another way to do that, the problem with longitudinal studies is they take a really, really long time to figure anything out, right? So a longitudinal study is good because it's the same subjects, so you have less variability in your data, but they take a very long time. So to get around that problem, in many studies, we'll do cross-sectional studies. And a cross-sectional study might measure, well, it does measure participants in different groups at the same time. So if we had the same vaccine that had been given for years and years and years, I would get a group of infants who had just received the vaccine. I would find maybe some fifth graders who had received that vaccine years and years ago, some high schoolers, some people your age, some people a little bit older, so on and so forth. So then I could collect all my data in a very short period of time and compare the groups that way. So that's the difference between a cross-sectional and a longitudinal study. Yes? I can. The cross-sectional studies compare participants in different groups at the same time. That work? Okay, good. So one of the major groupings of research methods that I want you to know about is the descriptive study. And descriptive studies are not experiments. We're not going to go in and manipulate anything. We're just going to sort of watch what's going on. We're going to describe what happens. The first example of these are the naturalistic. And in a naturalistic study, they are descriptive, the observer makes no attempts to change behavior. It's an attempt to categorize or characterize. So if you've ever seen the movie about Diane Fossey, Gorillas in the Mist, she was interested in gorilla behavior. She just went out with the gorillas, had her notepad, taking notes. There have been famous there have been famous studies done. People going in and studying Hell's Angels, these various cultural subgroups. And again, no attempts made to do anything except to document what's happening, so get some understanding of what's going on. So that's one effect or one type of descriptive studies. There's several types of them I'm not going to hold you responsible for, but just know that that's one way that things can be studied. Now, one of the problems with observational studies is observer bias. And the real problem, so we get expectancies. The experiment here that I refer to, I think, kind of gives you an idea, although it's not the perfect example. Rosenthal and Fode in 1963 did kind of an interesting experiment. They had undergraduates running rats in a maze, but it turned out that the rats weren't the subjects, the undergraduates were. So what they did in this study is they told the undergraduates, we have two groups of rats here. One group of rats is maze bright, and the other group of rats is maze dull. And we want you to run them through these mazes and tell us what their times are and so on and so forth. Now, it turned out that these two groups of rats were randomly selected out of the same batch. There was no difference between them, but because of the observer bias, their expectations, sure enough, the undergraduates thought that the maze dull rats performed worse than the maze bright rats. And it's not because the undergraduates were bad people. It was just the preconceived notions that came into play. Observer bias is a significant problem. There's no way to get around it if you know who your groups are. That's why in our studies we do what we call blinded experiments. You've heard of blinded groups, blinded researchers? A couple of you have. So the idea in a blinded experiment is, as a researcher, you don't know who's in which group. That's all coded, so you can't inadvertently influence things one way or the other. And your subject should never know what group they're in. So imagine, and this experiment's been done, people come to get an experimental medicine, and one group is told this pill costs $5, the other group's told it costs $50. But they don't know what the experiment is, so they're blinded to their condition in the group. They don't know that the other group's being told one thing or the other. But suppose you did the same thing to make it a little more clear. Suppose you had one group getting a placebo, one group getting the actual medicine. You don't want the people getting the placebo to know that they're getting it, because that would kind of mess you up. So that's what it means to be blinded to condition. And a good experiment, the best design, is one where we have a double-blinded experiment, to where neither the researcher or the participant knows where they're at. We have a few more minutes, do we not? Just a couple more? All right, I know people getting antsy. The next real problem that we get into with descriptive studies is reactivity. And reactivity is kind of the flip side to observer bias. Reactivity is when you know you're being observed. And when you know you're being observed, you sometimes behave different. Think about, Thanksgiving get-togethers or Christmas get-togethers, Everybody's acting like they normally do, probably like fools if it's like my family, and somebody brings out the camera. Well, everybody goes from their normal slouches to all kinds of great poses, and you're behaving differently in the presence of the camera. That's reactivity, and it's a significant problem.